Hello, welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse, and before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains. Too late. We're in the wrong timeline. We'll be forgotten, cast aside, and today we're going to discuss locomotives that had that exact thing happen to them. Locomotives that, historically, really weren't bad at all. In fact, some of them were very good. It was just bad timing. For one reason or another, they showed up, and yeah, they were good, but they couldn't really be used to their full potential, or in some cases, hardly at all. These are 5 locomotives that were cursed with poor timing. Southern Pacific Class GS6. GS6? What? I mean, we knew there were GS4s. That's Southern Pacific 4449. She's a GS4. They were a class of semi-streamlined 484 Northern types, operated by Southern Pacific from 1943 to 1958, as well as the Western Pacific Railroad from 1943 to 1953. 16 were built by Lima Locomotive Works. The GS in their name stands for Golden State, or General Service, so that's the case with the entire GS line, but the GS6s were meant to be a new evolution of that particular line. They placed an order for 14 new daylight locomotives from Lima in 1943. World War II was still ongoing, though, and the War Production Board restricted what types of locomotives could actually be built. So Southern Pacific's order was actually turned down because the board felt that streamlined passenger engines were not necessary to move wartime traffic. It was a waste of resources in their eyes, and to be fair, they probably weren't wrong. But it was still an unfortunate situation for Southern Pacific. So they redesigned the engines for general service, not just passenger service, and that got the order approved. As for Western Pacific, well, they were power-starved at that time, and were looking for new motor units and actually requested diesels, but then decided to go with a different style of steam locomotive, thinking they would be more readily available. The War Production Board wound up diverting 6 of the GS6s. They did differ slightly, as Southern Pacific's patents couldn't be included with those particular models. So Western Pacific's version had Franklin boosters be installed instead, and they referred to them as GS64-77s. The GS6s overall looked similar to the GS2s, with very flat faces, and they retained the skyline casing on the top of the boiler, but they didn't have side skirting like previous GS models had. The GS6s also were not given the orange and red daylight paint scheme, again due to wartime restrictions, and were instead painted gray and black, giving them the nickname of War Babies, or Baby Daylights, or sometimes just Black Lights. Western Pacifics were also given smoke deflectors, which was another unique thing about those models. Despite all these restrictions and differences, the GS6s turned out to be really good, but remember, they were built in the early 40s during World War II, and the entire industry was about to dieselize within a decade, and that's exactly what happened to them. When Western Pacific dieselized, they sold 3 of theirs to Southern Pacific for use in spare parts. Southern Pacific's lasted until 1958. In fact, one of them, 4460, the only survivor of the type, pulled the final movement of steam on Southern Pacific. She was donated to the National Museum of Transportation, where she's been ever since. Not only were her and her sisters too late to the party to really make much of a difference overall in terms of the steam age, but 4460 in particular is kind of considered pretty forgotten among preservation groups. She lives in the shadow of 4449, and as a result, she's often referred to as the Forgotten Daylight, or Black Daylight. So edgy! These humans, they have forgotten her. She dwells in the shadow, cast by the daylight. However, that may change someday. According to an interview that was conducted just this year with the museum, they're considering restoring 4460 back to full excursion service, just like her cousin. But just because they're thinking about it doesn't mean they have the money to do it. and it would be a few years off even if they started now. But in my opinion, I would love to see her shine, just like her daylight cousin. Even if 4449 always tells her that she's still going through her goth phase. It's not a phase, cousin! This is who I am! South Australian Railways 740 class. My Australian fans are particularly vocal, but very polite when it comes to requesting more stuff from their country, so I will do my best to accommodate. The 740s were a class of 282 freight locomotives that were built by Clyde Engineering in Granville for the South Australian Railways in 1951 and 1952. Oh yes, they were that late to the party, but there was a very good reason for it. See, technically the 740s weren't really built for Australia necessarily, at least not initially. The federal government issued an order for 50. These locomotives were supposed to be part of Australia's contribution to the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRRA, for the rehabilitation of China. It was assumed that this would be necessary once the Civil War was resolved, and then the communists won! Oh, awkward. Once China came under communist control, Australia's obligations to the effort kind of ceased. They weren't going to give the communists any locomotives. No steam engines for you. Never! But the government couldn't just get out of the contract with Clyde because, well, they'd taken up their shop space and they were a business, so they renegotiated and dropped the total down to 20. That's 10 of the 740 class. The other 10 were known as the L class and taken by the Commonwealth Railways. South Railways got the 740s. The only difference between them was that South Australian Railways had to convert theirs for broad gauge operation. The Ls did not have to have this modification. And the Ls honestly did worse than the 740s, not because they were bad, but because the Commonwealth Railways already had diesel locomotives on order. Some of the Ls they got were just placed immediately on the scrap line and never even entered service at all. And the few they did start using were withdrawn by May of 1959, all being scrapped in the mid-60s. The 740s lasted a little longer than that till the early 60s, but they were also replaced by diesels, and the last one was scrapped in November of 1965. There are no survivors of either, which is a real shame because there was nothing wrong with them. They were actually really good locomotives, built very well. They were just built for one purpose, and when that purpose ceased to exist, they didn't have a place anymore, especially on rail lines that were starting to replace steam entirely. It's a real shame. The El Gobernador. Gobernador? Gobernador? I'm not gonna lie, I don't know how to pronounce that properly, so I'm just gonna call her Ellie, just so we're clear. But this locomotive was built in February of 1883, and she was a 410 steam locomotive. She was a what? In what year? Why? Well, she was built by the Central Pacific Railroad at their own Sacramento, California shops. She was actually the last of their locomotives to receive an actual name, and is the only locomotive of that particular wheel arrangement to operate on US rails. At the time, she was the largest locomotive ever built, period. The wheel arrangement was often called the Mastodon type, which is really confusing, by the way, because there was an earlier engine that inspired its construction, known as Mastodon number 2229, which was the first successful 480 ever built. Both engines actually looked remarkably similar, except that Ellie over here was larger. Her construction was actually met with a great bit of fanfare, but it was not without incident. See, she's a unique case even on this list. She wasn't too late to the party. She was too early. At the time, there was really just no need for a locomotive as big as she was, and making a wheel arrangement that long was breaking new ground in terms of technologies. There were a lot of kinks to work out with her. It wasn't that she was bad necessarily in functional form. If they had gotten all the kinks and growing pains figured out, she probably would have been fine. It's not like there haven't been locomotives with that many driving wheels. But in 1883 it would have been unheard of, and they just really didn't know what they were doing, quite literally, because there was a lot of experimentation to do. Now, she was very powerful and very visually impressive, but her firebox was known to be too small, so the crews were not massive fans of her, and her cylinders, which were originally built with innovative rotary valves, weren't actually working properly, So they had to cast an all-new set of cylinders with more conventional slide valves, as well as the Stephenson valve gear. An 1885 rebuild tried to remedy a lot of her issues and even increased her weight. And they started using coal instead of wood, which probably did help quite a bit in terms of the steam economy. But she was never as successful as the railroad had hoped, and she was scrapped in July 15th of 1894. Truth is, a lot of her issues seem to be the result of rushing on Central Pacific's part. See, the president, Leland Stanford, really wanted her built, badly, as a show of brilliance for his railway, and that's understandable. Big engines draw attention, and that was good at the time. But like I said, nothing this size had ever been built before in terms of locomotives, and there were so many kinks to work out, and rushing it was not a good idea. Her frame had to be cast in 2 separate sections instead of all at once, because it was so big. And as soon as master mechanic A.J. Stevens figured anything out, Stanford immediately ordered that it be built and installed on the new engine without any time for, testing to make sure it actually worked. And Stanford didn't tell any of the other people in charge of the railroad about this little pet project of his. Charles Crocker once came through the works on a tour of inspection and saw the partially completed Ellie still under construction. Since he didn't know about it, he demanded to know what the heck that thing was, and when A.J. Stevens told him what it was, Crocker ordered that all work be stopped immediately. When Stanford came back to see that no work had been done, he was also annoyed, and when he was told that Crocker had told him to stop, he countermanded those orders in no uncertain terms. Manufacturing this thing was already a nightmare, and the management was not doing her any favors. Ellie was probably doomed from the start, which is unfortunate because, like I said, to be brutally honest, she really could have worked. But she was too early, the technology wasn't worked out, and though she's often viewed as a failure, I can't say, truthfully, that I personally blame her. I think if she was managed better, and more time taken with her construction, she may have turned out great, and could have resulted in an entire class of these large locomotives. But locomotives of that size wouldn't happen for a few more decades, at least not in significant quantities. The British Rail Class 14. Let it go, darkness. You have trains to talk about. The Class 14 has actually been brought up before, as I gave them their own little video on this channel, and I hate that video because it's actually a little screwed up factually, and it was, my mistake, and I hate that. I hate getting things wrong. I like to give you accurate information. So let's fix all that and try to correct everything I got wrong in that video. The Class 14s were diesel hydraulic locomotives that were built in the mid-1960s at Swindon Works, actually. Now, diesels and British Rail and 60s doesn't sound good from the get-go, but truth be told, the 14s actually turned out quite good. They were astonishingly useful little locomotives, and they were known by Swindon Works as teddy bears, due to a comment by Swindon Works erecting shop foreman George Cole, who once said that they've built the Great Bear, referring to a large steam engine they were once responsible for, and now they're going to build a teddy bear. Hence, the teddy bears, which is adorable. I love calling them that. They're cute. They're cute little diesels. And Swindon Works wound up doing a very good job with them. 56 were produced between 1964 and 1965, and it was found that, in use, they were actually quite good. But they weren't without their problems. Not due to reliability. They had no issues there. For one thing, they weren't that powerful in terms of tractive effort. Originally, they were allocated to depots on the western region, but in January of 1967, 20 were sent to Hull on the eastern region, followed by 13 more. They were meant to work around the docks, but the tasks there were beyond the capabilities of just one of them, so they needed 2. And that required 2 sets of crew, which the region hated. But they were very reliable and very helpful in jobs that they could manage. So why were they poorly timed? Well, that's due to 2 factors. These are smaller diesels, and thus they were mostly used for shunting duties. They could manage movements between local yards, as well as short-distance freight trains, but that didn't happen super often. And this is a problem, because British Rail had already built so many other shunters, namely the Class 08s. They built so many of those things, that needing a different type entirely was largely unnecessary. There was just no room for another type of diesel when the 08s were doing just fine. Additionally, British Rail would also ultimately decide to go with full diesel electric in terms of standardizing the diesels they were using. And that was a problem, because the 14s were diesel hydraulic. But truth be told, they didn't even get that far in terms of standardization because the duties they were meant for actually disappeared on the network a few years after they came into use. So they started being disposed of in 1968, and the entire class was sold or scrapped by the end of 1970. But the ones that were sold actually wound up with a working life 2 to 3 times longer than that of British Railways. And once into the 70s, that was well into the preservation movement, and small heritage railways adore tiny diesels. They are super useful to have around. The teddy bears were perfect for this, and 19 of the total of 56 that were built are considered in preservation. In fact, amazingly, one was leased in 2005, D9504, from its preservation group to National Railways, because they needed the extra tractive power from these little devils. They were working on the newest main line in the UK, High Speed 1, sometimes called the Channel Tunnel Rail Link. Yeah, she was doing main line work as late as 2005. So even though they never really got a chance to shine initially, it seems like these days, the survivors of the class are still looked at fondly, and they're actually among my favorite diesels ever. Look at them! They're teddy bears, they're so cute! The D.2311. What in the world is that thing? That's weird. Do I have my list mixed up? Is this not a mad science experiment? Oh, it is, but it still counts for this? Really? Huh, okay. The D.2311 is Italian, built by Ansaldo, and tested between the 19th of March and the 3rd of May in 1928. I assure you this locomotive is not what you think it is, because looking at it, I mean, with the cylinder and the seemingly a steam reservoir, I mean, this is obviously some kind of weird steam engine, right? Nah, this is a diesel. Yeah, really. And it's not even a regular kind of diesel. Oh, no. This is a diesel pneumatic locomotive. Now, I have discussed the idea of diesel pneumatics before, but the one I talked about back then wasn't very good. The 2311, however, was based off of maturing technology, and had been researched prior to, and Ansaldo had been working on the concept for a while, since 1919 in fact, though this test session looked ridiculous when actually put to the test. Well, it turned out that she actually performed quite well. No, seriously, despite being weird as heck, being diesel pneumatic, she actually functioned. Just to be safe, they actually coupled her with a 3-phase spare locomotive, but 2311 never needed any help, ever. She always handled the trains just fine by herself, and did a phenomenal job of showing the potential of this interesting technology that was way ahead of the time. So why was she poorly timed? Well, it's true she was ahead of the time, but that wasn't why her timing was poor, because Italian state railways were interested. But fate had a different idea in mind for this poor locomotive. For one thing, she was involved in a serious accident. Now, that wasn't her fault at all, but it did cause her heavy damage. At the same time, a severe economic crisis hit Italy as a whole, and thus Ansaldo could not justify the cost of rebuilding her, nor was the state railways interested in something brand new when it was cheaper just to produce more steam locomotives or use what they had. They just didn't have the money to invest in the tech, no matter how impressive it may have seemed. So no more examples were built, and the remains of 2311 were scrapped. Diesels in general wouldn't show up on the Italian railways until after World War II, and those technologies were largely pioneered by other nations, which is unfortunate, because it seems like the Italians may have really been onto something here. Based on reputable sources, she was a genuinely decent locomotive. She just never had a chance. And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders. SomeDude267, Orange Glass, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Josh Johnson, Metal for Life Guy, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Tommy Rossini, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Joshua Long, Brian, Jack Carson's Row Videos, Hayden DeGro, Master of None, Dr. Racist 78, Lord Hawk 444, Alaric Jaspers, The Baxter, That Guy with a Beard, Mark Holding, Lock Kraken, Crystal Morgan, A Person 723, DN Trouble Typhoon, Ohio Trucker 1, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, Alfonso Lapuche, Royal Hudson 2860, and Ice Surfer 1405. Till next time, this This is darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.